So while we wait for everyone to join, where are we joining from? I'm in North Wales, where it's all a bit grey and rainy. Ali, I know you're in London. Is that in central London?
Near Wimbledon tennis, very close to Wimbledon tennis.
Nice, how
So,
lovely.
yeah.
Dani, where are you?
I'm in rural Hertfordshire, where it's sunny now. It's a nice evening.
This is good. And how about you, Nicole?
I'm in Kent in Sevenoaks, where it's also sunny today. For the first time in weeks, the sun's come out.
Well, that's lovely. Just me with the grey rain then, which is probably not a surprise, given that I'm in Wales. Have you guys been writing today?
I have. I've been writing, and I bunked off a little bit and sat in the garden and was reading Would I Lie to You, actually. I was trying to finish it before tonight. I haven't quite finished it, but well, we have a part-time nanny and she's been off for 2.5 weeks, and she came back today, the first day I could work really, and the sun came out. I was like, I really want to sit in the garden and read. So did a bit of writing, bit of reading in the garden.
That sounds brilliant. Well, listen, I think we better kick off before we get swept away into small talk. Huge welcome to everyone that's joining us tonight, whether you're watching it live or catching up on Head of Zeus's YouTube channel. I'm Claire Macintosh. I'm an author, but I'm not the one you're going to be hearing most of the things from tonight. You're going to be hearing from 3 amazing authors. So I'm going to introduce them now, and excuse me for checking my notes because there's a lot going on and I don't want to miss anything. So first up, we've got Aliya Ali-Afzal, whose debut novel, Would I Lie to You, is a page-turning, tense and funny look at what happens when you have your dream life, but you're about to lose it. It was published to wide acclaim in July this year, with Sophie Kinsella, the queen of women's fiction, describing it as warm, intelligent, and keeps up the tension right up until the end. Aliya's second novel is due next autumn. Dany Atkins is an award-winning and best-selling novelist who's written, and I'm in awe of this, 8 novels and a novella. Her latest book was published just last week. It's called The Wedding Dress, and it's an emotional and heartwarming collection of 3 irresistible love stories, all linked by one very special dress. Her next novel, 6 Days, will be published next April. I already love that title, so I'm hoping we'll be able to hear a little bit about that later. And finally, Nicole Kennedy's debut novel is Everything's Perfect, a smart and sharply observed story about friendship, parenting, and the pressure to be perfect. It was published in June this year and was described by author Louise Hare as a witty, no-filter glance at the reality of becoming and remaining a social media influencer. Nicole's second book, After Paris, will be published next July. Nicole, I hope you've noticed that I've acquired a plant in my office purely to match the plant on your book cover. Such is the dedication that I show to my panelists. Now, what I want to know from you guys to kick us off is, do we think that there is pressure on women in particular? We might talk about men later, but is there pressure on men on women to be perfect, and where does that come from? So Aliya, Pfizer's search for perfection is very much about fitting in, isn't it? So can you tell us a little bit more about who Pfizer is and who she's trying to fit in with?
So Pfizer is a very happily married woman. She's married to Tom. She has 3 children, and she lives in London, and she lives a very nice life in Wimbledon Village. And this is very different to, her circumstances growing up, where she had a very modest kind of upbringing. She's also British Pakistani. She's married to Tom. He's white. And growing up, she always felt a little different. So she won a scholarship to a private school where, she was surrounded by people who are much wealthier than her. She was, obviously, because of her skin, because of her culture, because of her background, always seen as a little different. And now she's really been embraced by this group of yummy mummies. She's living the dream life. And she finally feels she kind of fits in and belongs and doesn't have to tense up every time she goes into, a room. And this is where she's at. It's something she never had when she was growing up. And so this is kind of her desire to sort of fit in.
Okay, and fitting in, of course, for her comes at a cost, quite literally. So we'll come back to that a bit later. But I'm intrigued by the fact that quite often the subject of perfection is closely tied to money. That the two are sort of inextricably linked. Dani, your novel starts with a woman, Suzanne, who's shopping in a very expensive wedding dress shop, sort of shop that makes you feel quite nervous just sort of being in. And weddings, women spend so much money, some women spend so much money on weddings, to the point where the trappings can almost overshadow the vows themselves. And I thought that you tackled this really brilliantly in The Wedding Dress by centering the story, 3 separate stories really, on one of those trappings, on the dress itself. What was the inspiration for that?
I'm going to sound terribly shallow here when I say that the inspiration is born of an obsession with either say yes to the dress, or don't tell the bride, or anything else that you're probably going to find on Channel 4 during the day when you should be writing and you're instead deciding to look for inspiration. These are just programs that I've loved. Fascination with weddings, because you're right, we do put a lot of pressure on ourselves to get the perfect wedding, and even more so I think now in the days of social media, where the wedding has to look good so that you can put it online. I mean, it ceases to be just a video for your memories. It is very, very much who can have the best wedding, the best first dance, the best location, and it's almost become not the real emotion of a couple joining together and committing together and fun to family and friends. It's almost a show. And I think I was very aware that out of the 3 weddings in the book, it was Suzanne's that was going to be the one that fitted that mold. And it's sad, because I think that somewhere along the way we're losing the reason why we want to celebrate a wedding, in our quest for the perfect day, the perfect reception, and the perfect video that you can then show off with.
Yeah, I agree. And I was talking to a photographer friend of mine recently who said that people are not, many of her customers aren't even picking up their physical prints anymore. As soon as they've got them online, that's kind of all they want. They don't want them in a frame even. So this, Nicole, this is precisely what's explored in your debut novel, this sort of separation between what we put online and who we are underneath. So Cassie's life is all curated, it's filtered, but things are very, very different for her under the surface. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I think Cassie's experience is kind of a high octane version of what we all go through to some extent. Like Dani was saying, almost I feel sometimes now we don't just live our lives to live them and enjoy them. You know, sometimes you walk past something beautiful and you think, oh, I'll take a picture to put that online. You're not just enjoying the thing anymore. Like I was watching the closing ceremony of the Olympics and I felt quite sad how many people were walking in holding their phones up. I thought, you'll be able to go on YouTube tomorrow and see so much of this and you're not in the moment anymore and enjoying it anymore. And that's what's happened to Cassie. She's sort of lost her grip on being in the moment and the reality of motherhood. And as she's found motherhood harder, that distance, and she's sort of poured herself online to kind of claw back a bit of herself, that gap's getting wider and wider until she hits crisis point, really, because she can't then reconcile the two.
So how do you feel as a woman, as a wife, a mother, those of you who are mothers, what does society expect from you, and how do you feel you measure up to that? Who wants to dive in with some of those answers?
I'll go.
Right.
I think society expects everything from us as mothers, as wives, in terms of your job, in terms of whatever you do. I feel like women aren't given as much slack, and I think you're expected to achieve highly in every area of your life. I don't know how well I'm doing with that, probably not very. Trying to consciously find balance between those things. And yeah, you know, some days achieving it, some days failing and making a big mess of it. I think that's just the reality of yeah, I don't know, modern motherhood in my experience.
I was going to say, actually, you know, when you're saying you don't know how well you're doing at it, I think it's so insidious how it gets to us that we start, you know, measuring ourselves, even when we know it's a ridiculous kind of barometer, and we do it. And I think I was so interested in writing, you know, about this subject, because I think it's so dangerous, actually, this kind of pressure to be perfect. It kind of seeps into our psyche on an individual level. And all these things like, you know, imposter syndrome and low self-esteem, and all these things come from a place where you're never good enough, you know. And in terms of motherhood, you know, I've had an interesting experience because I was a stay-at-home mother for about 10 years. Then I went back to work full-time. Then I worked part-time. And at each stage, somebody had something bad to say about, you know, what I was doing. So when I was a stay-at-home mother, you know, I'm wasting my education. Did I study just to change nappies? You know, I'm not pulling my weight. I'm not interesting enough. When I'm working, you're neglecting your children. And when you're working part-time, you know, everybody can bash you. And yeah, so I think, you know, there are really serious connotations in society, really, that spring from this basic thing of this pressure we put on ourselves as well to be perfect.
I completely agree. So how do we rise up against that? Dani, what do we do to stop ourselves feeling as though we have to conform to somebody else's idea of perfection?
I think it's addressing the balance and actually taking a step out of your life and seeing, you know, it through an outsider's eyes almost, and seeing how well you actually are doing, and to stop and congratulate yourself, because I think we're all our worst critics and our harshest critics. And whether it's in the pages of fiction or on the screen or somewhere or online or Instagram, everybody is doing it better than you as far as you're concerned. And of course we're not. We're all failing equally or succeeding equally, and hiding the truth from friends, family, loved ones even. And I think that also touches us on, you know, the area of mental health and how looking and asking for help is seen as a failure, and obviously it's not. I'm glad that it's finally becoming recognized that it's okay to say I'm not okay.
Absolutely.
And that hasn't been the case for a very, very long time. And every time somebody, be it a celebrity or a personality or anyone, comes out and says, this isn't working for me, I'm actually failing here, I'm struggling, you know, not waving, drowning. And that will help everyone long term. But it's a very hard thing to do, you know, to actually say, this isn't right, I'm in need of help. We're terrible at asking for it, and we need to get better.
We are, absolutely. And I think what fiction does so brilliantly is it encourages empathy. You're asking readers to step inside someone else's shoes and walk with them for 400 pages and reflect on what they might do in that situation. And all three of you in your novels, in very different ways, encourage the reader to think about dilemmas, about moral dilemmas. And I was thinking about, I obviously don't want to spoil these books for anyone watching, so I'm always really careful about how I ask questions. Those of you watching at home, if you've got questions, then put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and I will read them out later. Dani, I could have picked any of the three situations that your characters find themselves in, but the one that really touched me, that I want to talk to you about, is Mandy, who learns something about her grandmother that she chooses not to share right away with her parents. Can you tell us a bit more about Mandy and that relationship with her grandmother, and sort of what that scenario is? And what I'm really interested in is whether you would do the same thing as Mandy.
Yeah, Mandy is one of the youngest protagonists that I've ever written. So she's only 17 years old, and she's she's close to her parents. She's an only child, but she's incredibly close to her grandmother. They share a love of music. Her grandmother taught her to play the piano. She was a piano teacher. And when she was widowed, it kind of like, in a way, it started a whole new chapter in her grandmother's life, and she goes to live in a rather nice retirement home, and her life takes on a new direction. And being very careful not to spill the beans too much here as well. But the only person that she feels initially she can confide in is her granddaughter. I think she knows that her own son is still grieving very much for her partner, her husband. And that Mandy will probably be a more sympathetic pair of ears. And I loved writing this relationship between a granddaughter and a grandmother. I've not really done anything that sort of skipped a generation before. I've got a lot of my protagonists in previous books have had close relationships with their parents, be they in sort of, you know, middle to late middle age, or some of them have sadly, you know, Alzheimer's. So I've explored kind of that, but this was the first time that I actually touched on how it can skip a generation, and that this close friendship, this bond, and reaching out between the two of them was a real joy to write. And I didn't really know, you know, how the story was going to evolve, and I didn't know whether the parents would come on board, but it was actually a lovely ride to take, and to find, you know, hopefully a satisfactory solution at the end of it. And yeah, I wish I'd actually had that kind of relationship with my own grandmother, but I didn't. But it kind of made me wistful for that.
It is really it was my favorite of the three stories, because of that relationship, which, as you say, isn't something that we see very much in fiction, and actually older women in particular is something that I'd like to see more of. You know, older women who still have aspirations and goals and lives to live. It's a very lovely character indeed. Nicole, Cassie's a hot mess, right? She her Insta career is imploding. She meets this new mum, Beth, is that right? But she doesn't introduce herself properly, does she? She doesn't say, I'm Cassie, I'm this mega famous online persona. She introduces herself as Sandy, just, you know, a regular mum. Why does she do that? And part two of my question, have you ever found yourself not necessarily giving a different name, but being two people, playing two roles?
So firstly, she does it almost on instinct. I think she's already starting to realise she's in a bit too deep with her social media career, and wanting to, she's kind of like missing her old life and the way she used to feel when she was a regular mum, a regular person, I think, before she had children even. And I think it happens instinctively, but then it kind of helps her reconnect a bit with her past self, not having, you know, that kind of banner social media superstar attached to her means she can enter into a friendship on her like own terms, and without having to worry. She can be honest, and she can tell the truth about what her situation is really like, and that becomes a really essential thing to her as their friendship develops, that she has that outlet. Part two of your question, I'm not sure actually. I don't think I ever have. I mean, I think there's, well, I was working part-time before so I was a solicitor, and I worked full-time after my first son, and then part-time after my second son, and then I wrote my book on my third mat leave. So I had tried kind of all different ways really of working when my sons were young, and definitely when I was part-time, I found that more challenging, and it was having a bit of more of a switch of a headspace between working Nicole and home Nicole. And I think especially when you're part-time working and it's a real glitch in the system, because we need, you know, it'd be good if more people work part-time. I just felt like I was failing everywhere. You're kind of failing at work, you're failing at home, and that's very difficult. That's probably the closest I've come to feeling like I was almost living a kind of dual existence, where I was, you know, trying to be a great mum, but also trying to, I think there's just, it's so difficult when you're at work part-time. You know, I'd leave work at like 5, go home, put my son to bed, then I'd log on in the evening, but I was still called a part-timer as I left, even though my colleagues would leave at like 6 or 6:30, and then I'd log on later, and they'd be in the pub or something. That finding a balance between that, I think that's, you do feel a bit split in two in that situation. But I've not encountered a Cassie type scenario where I've used a different name and identity or anything like that.
And I think what you've just mentioned, that sort of that perception of you being a part-timer, even though actually you're working just as hard, if not harder, that's very much down to appearances, isn't it? It's the guy who arrives early and puts his jacket over the chair and then goes off to the canteen or whatever, and stays there late, but he's had numerous lunch breaks. And I encountered a lot of that in the police when, like you, I was sort of working to fit around my childcare and dashing in and dashing out and working from home. I'm not sure what the answer is to that, but I'm hopeful that home working and Zoom working is sort of actually mixing up what we see as the perfect hardworking person. Aliya, I want to return to Faiza's dilemma, which I mentioned at the start, but we haven't told the people watching at home what her dilemma is. So in essence, she has spent the family savings, right? And instead of owning up now, she tries to pay it back before she's discovered. Firstly, tell us why she spent it, and then I want to know whether you would do the same thing that she does.
Well, I mean, going back to what we were talking about, perception is such a big thing because it is impossible to be perfect. We know this, okay? So whether you're trying to appear perfect, as Faiza's on the one hand trying to appear perfect and fit in with, with the sort of things that the yummy mummies do, but also sometimes you want to appear perfect even in relationships because you don't want to show your flaws and even to be liked and loved. So even with her husband, she's made this awful mistake. She's done a terrible thing. And she wants to put it right because she says, it's my fault. I've put everything at risk. I need to fix this. But also she doesn't want him to see this bad bit about her. So I think a lot of perfection and, deceit even comes down to the fact that we're either wanting to be accepted or liked, sadly, because we're told that we have to be good and nice and perfect for people to like us. So this is kind of why she spent this money, and this is why she doesn't want to tell him, because she's afraid that maybe he will judge her, but not so much that she's disappointed him, basically, that she's disappointed him and she wants to fix it. Would I do the same? No, because it's so stressful because, I could tell one lie, but as we know, her one lie leads to a million other lies. And I don't think I have the headspace. I'm too old now to keep up track of all these. I'd be writing notes on my iPhone to remind me.
Brilliant. And Faiza, of course, she's also battling two very different cultural views of what perfection is. How do the two compare and where do they conflict?
I think it's not necessarily the different views of what's expected of her as a woman, because I was also really keen to write the kind of British Asian women that I knew in my family and amongst my friends, but I never really see, in fiction a lot or on TV. And there's nothing really that different about them. So, my friends are lawyers and surgeons and entrepreneurs and teachers, and they have their families, they live, there's no specific expectation, to be honest with you. And it was the same as her British friends. I think the pressure comes because how she's perceived, because of her skin color. People have all these assumptions, and often they're stereotypical assumptions that are heaped onto her just by her appearance. And in a way, I was trying to, I hope I've shown that, that isn't the whole story. The stories that we see are accurate. And of course, there are those situations where there's a more traditional setup, but that's a little spectrum. That's not my experience, So for example, her parents don't mind her being married to Tom. her community don't mind it. Everybody's cool with it. And that's been my experience in my family and my friends. So I think the perception is really how other people perceive her. That's where the duality comes in, not in essence in what the expectations are from each culture.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about the writing process. Dani, you just mentioned that you didn't really know where it was going. And so that's the sort of thing that genuinely fills me with fear as a writer, because I'm such a planner. What I really want to talk about is structure with all of you, because none of these novels are straightforward. They all hold back information. They all drop it in at a particular time. Your novel, Dani, is essentially 3 interlinked novellas. Which is so unusual, because you pick it up as a novel, it presents as a novel. Is that always the structure that you had in mind, and was it easier or harder to write than a conventional novel?
It was always going to be 3 different stories. I think I was probably inspired by the idea, I mean, apart from the fact that I knew it was going to feature weddings and a wedding dress. There was a film I saw many years ago, probably before anyone was born now, called The Yellow Rolls Royce, and this was about a vehicle that was owned by 3 very different people. So kind of like the Black Beauty-esque kind of story, that you've got different owners of an object or a horse or whatever, and the stories aren't necessarily linked in that the characters will ever necessarily meet, but there's some things that will tie them in together. And so each story was a standalone story. I actually wrote them between other novels, because this was something that I wrote off-piste. So it was a passion project of mine. So I wrote the first section, Suzanne's section, between two or three novels ago now, and then had to put it away. And it kept sort of talking to me from the drawer, but I thought, no, it's not your time yet. You'll have to wait until I've finished all my edits on the next one. And then it came out again, and that was quite nice, because it kind of got a chance to percolate a bit, and different things occurred to me and different ideas, but the inspiration behind each story was always there in the back of my head. But I'm unlike you. I'm not a planner. I'm the pantster, but I do know where things are going to end. So I normally know where they start, I know where they'll end, but the middle bit is always a bit of a, I wonder what's happening next. And I deliberately enjoy and embrace that part of it, because I'm along with the ride like the reader is. So if it's not interesting me, then there's a fair chance it's not going to interest them. I was explaining to my daughter today that after I finished a book, I then do a chapter by chapter breakdown and analysis. And somebody once asked me, do you do that before? I thought, no, I couldn't do that, because I would find that too restrictive. So I don't do that until the end, but then at the end it's very useful to see where you actually traveled along the journey. But in the middle bit, it's a bit like driving with your headlights off, so it's a bit scary, not to be recommended if you're of a nervous disposition.
And so once you've got that analysis, so I find that fascinating, because that's pretty much what I do at the start. So my chapter breakdown, and then I return to it at the end and sort of look at tension and all sorts. What do you do with that breakdown once you've got to the end of that draft and you've written down your map effectively?
I use it if we're doing edits. It's going to be vital then. So it's more of use, I suppose, to my editor, copy editor, and myself when I'm going through the manuscript. And it's like the synopsis that you write before you send it, write even chapter 1. I love to read my synopsis after I've typed to the end, and then think, well, that had absolutely nothing to do with the book I've just written. It might bear a passing resemblance somewhere along the way, but you kind of learn after a while that they're not set in stone, and it shouldn't be set in stone, because it's a living, breathing thing, a book. It takes its own life on sometimes, and you just have to let it.
Absolutely. Aliya, your novel has a lot in common with a thriller, which is one of the reasons I loved it, because thrillers are my jam. It's got that sense of a ticking clock, a sort of countdown to a metaphorical explosion. Did that structure come first? And how easy was it to maintain that tension? Because it's got an incredible momentum that takes you right through to the end. How hard was it to manage that structure?
I mean, I love thrillers. They're my favorite kind of books, and I love page turners. So I always knew that the suspense was going to be a key element. And a bit like Dani, I knew what happened at the start. I knew what happens at the end. So the first line of the book and the last line of the book haven't changed at all. Not a word has changed. And I have like a skeleton, key kind of plot points. I do like to know those main plot points. But then, the characters around the main character. So I had Tom and Faiza. Then everybody else kind of came in and developed around them. So I'm kind of a halfway, I think. I have like these little posts in between, but I don't know how we're going to get there. So I have maybe some lights on, Dani, not completely.
Well, let's find out whether Nicole has her headlights on. Everything's perfect was kind of blew my mind a bit, because you've got so many substrands, and each of them have got their own reveal, which comes in at just the right time. And so I can't imagine you having that in your head, but maybe you did.
So I drove with the lights off like Dani, and I would never do it again because I was as brave as Dani. So I drove with the lights off and I wrote the whole thing. Like because I had a small baby and I didn't have much time, I set myself a target of just writing 1,000 words a day. So I was like, oh, I don't need a plan. I'm just going to go for this. Like psychologically, it was important to me to complete a book because I tried lots of times and not finished one. So I just did that, got to the end, and it was basically a mess. And then when I signed with my agent, I spent like a year working through it and tightening it up and having to kind of go backwards and re-engineer a lot of it. So I found that such a painful process that this time I have a plan, which I'm faithfully sticking to. I'm veering a little bit off course, but I'm quite enjoying having the structure and the plan, mainly because I hope that means I don't have to go back and do such a huge rework as I did after the first time. But in terms of the reveals, I did have those. I did have those largely like in my head, but I had more strands, Claire, and I had to really pull them back. I remember the first time at my agent Nell, she was like, "You've just like thrown everything in here, like it's like writing room 101. Like you need to strip some of that out."
Less is more sometimes. Less is more. I'm still having palpitations over something that Dani just slipped in there at the end of her last answer, which is if we have edits, not when we have edits, but if I have edits is what she said. So can I just reel us back to that? Because are you saying that you won't always have edits, that you will produce a clean first draft?
I have produced one book that was a clean first draft. I'm not going to name it because I think everybody's then going to say, "Oh my God, well you could tell that, couldn't you?" But yes, I've been fortunate that I edit as I go, which I know is not everybody's way of doing things. So I suppose I submit fairly clean first drafts in, but then they're not really first drafts when I've spent the whole of every working day going back over what I wrote the day before. And I always work on the basis that if I fell under a bus that was no more, that somebody could pick up the manuscript and think, "Oh, I can finish that. That's okay. I can see it's quite tidy here." So yeah.
I would say, Dani, that is as close to perfection as I've ever encountered. I certainly could not allow someone to even read my manuscript if I fell under a bus, let alone finish it. So editing then, Aliya, what sort of editing process did you have for this debut?
Well,
enjoy it?
we had a lot of editing. first with my agent and then with my editor. And in a way, I find it really comforting because it made me realize that it's kind of a craft as well, and that you can change things and it's okay, and you can actually improve things. It's because I do like to get my first draft down. You know, I am kind of in a frenzy when I write. I have this story inside me bursting to come out. I have to get it out. And then I edited myself, of course, before I submitted to agents. And with my agent, I think we did a couple of drafts. Then with my editor, and I feel really relaxed now about it, because, you know, when you're writing your debut, you feel like you have to get it right and it has to be perfect. And actually you can tweak things, you know. So for example, like Nicole, I had to take some strands out. I added some other things, and it seemed like such a daunting task, but I did it. It was better for it. And so I've really got a lot of comfort with the whole editing process now.
And how do you know, all of you, when your novel is perfect? How do you know when it's finished?
I don't think there's ever a point. I think one of my editors once said that, you know, you can always edit. You know, there's no stopping point. And then you can look back at your own book that you've written 5 years later and think, I'd do that differently now. You know, I wouldn't have that scene. I wouldn't go that direction. So I think it sometimes you're just got your eye on the calendar. You know, and we have to stop now, otherwise it's not actually going to get published, you know. But you will keep polishing, and I don't think there is ever a point where you can say there's nothing more to do. There's probably always something more that could have been done, but logistically you have to actually just finally, you know, zip it up and walk away and say, okay, you're not perfect, you know, because nothing's perfect, but you're as good as you're going to be.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I would imagine that lots of people, everyone in fact, who's watching from home today is thinking that you guys are pretty much perfect. You know, you are all published authors. You achieved such an incredible goal of having your books. I mean, look at them. They are absolutely beautiful, those books. And Dani, I've got some of your other your backlist as well, and they are just stunning. Tell me about your covers, and, you know, just thinking about what we've talked about how the image that we present to the world is not always what we are underneath. How do you feel about your covers for these books, and how well do they represent what's lying beneath?
I mean, I'll start, because my cover, I had no idea what my cover would be. It just had never occurred to me. And so when I saw it, was not anything I was expecting, but I love the way the sand timer was used, because, you know, there is a countdown in the book. And so I love that. And I thought it was really clever. And I love the way, you know, the question is the main thing, because that's kind of what drives the whole book. So I really love it. And I love that the colors are bright. So not what I was expecting, but maybe it's good in a way. I had no expectations. So I was open.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, designers do such a phenomenal job at interpreting not just the story, but the feel of a book. And that's what I love about your cover, and the sort of suggestion of somebody slipping through your fingers as well as time running out is so brilliantly done. Nicole, what did you expect from your cover, and what did you think when you were given it?
I mean, I think there was a slightly different brief in terms of I was expecting something slightly different. But when I saw my cover, I just loved it. And the original idea hadn't been my idea. You know, I was told, oh, we're going to go for this. And I thought, oh, that sounds good. And then I saw something that was different, but I loved that too. I have to say, I think Head of Zeus do great covers and book production, great spines. That, you know, they're really good books. And now that I know you've bought a plant after seeing my cover, Claire, my book's an influencer now itself. It's influenced your plant.
Let me just show you something which illustrates the whole topic of this event. Hang on, I'm going to get up. I haven't got round to potting it up yet. It's just hidden behind here. It's just what I want to present for the moment.
All about the placement.
We're all hiding something. Dani, you're our veteran, not in age, but in number of books. You've had a lot of covers. There must have been some you didn't like. How does that feel?
Very hard, actually. I have to say that, you're guided in a lot of ways by your publisher. You might have an idea in your head of how you think your book should look. Some of it is led by what else is happening in the rest of the market at the time. You don't want a cover that's going to be identical to somebody else's. Sometimes it's the retailers who have a bigger say than perhaps readers realize in what will work on a shelf in a bookshop. Some of my covers I haven't been so fond of. Some I've absolutely adored. My very first cover of my first book, which is Fractured, it's actually, you can just see behind me there, the bottom half is, I loved that so much, it's actually been made into a canvas print. So that is a gorgeous cover. I think the strangest covers that I've probably seen are the foreign translations, which are very, very interesting when you're lucky enough to be published in other countries, and you see some of the covers are particularly unusual. You do have to then just go with the fact that they know their market, they know what their readers want, and a Lithuanian cover might not be the same as your Russian cover and your Hungarian cover, but I love them all. It's like children, you can't say that any of them are ugly because that's not allowed, and you have an attachment to every single cover, even if the only word on it you can actually make out is your name.
And that's what you say about trusting the marketers, trusting the people, that's the job they do. Your job, our job, is just to write the best possible book we can write. And on that note, I want to know what you're writing now, and then we're going to do some questions. If you haven't already put your question in the Q&A box, I would love to see your questions in there. There's a couple in there already, and don't forget that if you've not bought your books yet, you'll find a link to everybody's books in the chat box. So you just click on that and buy your copies now while we're talking. So the next book, which for Aliya and Nicole is the difficult second book. So let's start with you two before we perhaps get a little bit of advice from Dani and hear what she's working on now. Aliya, how is the second book going?
I was really happy to hear Dani say that it's very hard, because I think I am finding it hard, not actually getting into the story, but just kind of wondering how to do it better in terms of, I wrote a lot of words last time, so I'm trying to do it, I had to cut a lot, so I'm just trying to be a bit more conscious about that. So kind of trying to put all my experience to use, rather than, as I said before, I kind of wrote the draft in a frenzy and I didn't really have any idea what I was doing or what the expectations are. So I think that's the key thing. But the story and the people, I'm loving writing, because it's so good to be writing, and it's so good to have that feeling that this is what I do now. It's the most amazing feeling, because so it's that emotional thing is really wonderful this time.
And can you tell us anything about that book?
Not at the moment. Do you mind? It's just too early. Yeah.
Absolutely fine. Nicole, what can you tell us about your next book?
My book's called After Paris, and it's about three women who've been best friends for about 20 years, and they have one weekend in Paris together, a city that they've spent a lot of time in, and after one fateful weekend they never speak again, but none of them really understand why. And so half the book is the build-up and the weekend in Paris, and then the other half is the fallout from what happens in Paris. And I've seen my second cover already, and I almost like it more than the first.
Wow.
So that's exciting. So I think that the cover and the production is a lot more advanced than my actual writing of the book, so I don't think about that too much, or I'll panic.
Great. Well, we shall look forward to seeing a cover reveal in due course. Dani, does it get any easier after the second book?
I'd like to say yes, because everybody wants to hear that it does. But no, I think for all the authors I've ever spoken to, I don't think the fear ever goes away. The fear that, you might be done, you might have peaked, that last book might have been the best that you're ever going to do. And sometimes that fear is good because it spurs you on to be better. Sometimes it can be paralyzing, which is not so good, obviously. But I think that's good because you're always learning. I mean, nobody should be, doing this and not seeing that their writing is getting stronger, their confidence is growing, you know a little bit more about what you're doing, where you're trying to go. But I don't think it's an easier thing, because each book is completely different, unless if you're writing in a series, and I've never done that, but perhaps that becomes easier because you're already building on a structure that you've already know works, and you've got characters that you can then pull back in. But so you'd probably have to ask people who've written sort of series of books if that becomes an easier event. But I think first page, chapter 1, blank screen, it's always that, can I do it again? Will I do it again? And then, I have a friend who's an author who actually has such crippling fear before she writes the next book that she reads her last book again and says, oh yeah, look, I can do this, and she actually has to physically read her book. That wasn't so bad. So,
I don't think I could do that, because there would be so much discrepancy between the finished draft of my last book and the hot mess that is the first draft of my next one. Let's take some questions from the audience. So one of these we've answered already, whether you plan the plot or figure it out. We know that one. I'd like to know, we don't have a name of this person, but one of our attendees would like to know, do you aim to create flawed women, or does it happen by accident? Who would like to dive into that? Flawed women.
I very consciously wanted a flawed character, and for all the reasons that I said at the beginning, because I feel there is such a pressure on women. And I was really worried, to be honest, because I was worried that people wouldn't like her, they would judge her. And what I've found, and I've been delighted with, is that I would say 90% of people say that even though we were screaming in frustration at her, we also wanted to hug her. And that through the book, they kind of understood her motivation. And I think this is what I really wanted, because in a way I wanted people to not judge so much, understand somebody's motivation and see that they could like someone who wasn't perfect.
Absolutely. Nicole, did you set out to write flawed characters?
I was just going to, actually, before I say that, I just want to say about Pfizer. She really gives me Becky Bloomwood vibes, who's one of my favourite characters ever written. And I think you've really achieved, as Sophie Kinsella has done there, where you are like, what are you doing? But you still love that character. You're not angry with them. You're rooting for them. And considering the kind of stuff they get up to, it's quite an impressive thing to pull off. In terms of me, we've already touched on, we're all flawed people, right? So I want to write realistic characters, and I set out to write realistic characters, and being flawed is part of that, I think.
True.
Dani, how about you? I would say your characters in this particular book are probably less obviously flawed than Aliya's and Nicole's, but you've got some really well-rounded characters. You've also got some baddies in there who do some really unpleasant things. Do you set out to write characters with flaws?
No, I would say probably not. I think probably my previous books as well, the characters aren't flawed, but I put them in the most diabolical, awful, heart-wrenching situations, where they are very much, their lives are about to change one way or the other. It's sort of the kind of book that I hope that you read and you think, what would I do in that circumstance? So it's more that the characters, I'm trying to make them every man, every woman, relatable, but certainly the situations that I've put them in are pretty cruel, actually, pretty horrible.
They certainly are. They really are. You've had 8 published books and a novella. Have you got other books that are unpublished? So Sally Jenkins has asked us whether you've written any books that didn't find an agent or a publisher. And she said before your debut, but actually this could happen at any time in your career. So do you have bottom drawer books?
I have a bottom drawer, yes, YA fantasy, which I never quite found a home, and I'm never going to give up on it finding one day. But that was a real passion project, which I wrote about the same time, just after I'd written my very first book, Fractured, but before it had found a publishing home. So I was more convinced that my YA fantasy, which probably I wrote on the tail end of the Twilight sort of, you know, phenomena and passion, and yes, there aren't vampires in it, but it's sort of supernaturally, and I do have to be reined in from that occasionally, from, you know, wanting to venture out into that area. But yes, so that one is definitely one that I would like to see published. There are about 2 or 3 that are even further back in the cupboard that I never want to see published. But, yeah, appalling.
Aliya, was Would I Lie to You your first novel that you'd written?
It really was. It's the first thing, and I started writing in my very late 40s, and this was the story I wanted to tell. I started to write it. I had to stop actually for 3 years. I wasn't sure if I was cut out to write. My life kind of was so busy, but I couldn't forget the story. So yeah, first one ever written. So very much a debut. Yeah.
Amazing. And did you submit to an agent cold, or were you introduced? How did that happen?
No, absolutely cold. So I finished it, sent it to, I think, about 5 agents. 2 I had been introduced to. I'd met one at a writing conference where you sort of submit 1,000 words. And I met this agent, and she said, when it's done, send me the full manuscript. And similarly, they had actually an open day at a literary agency, the same thing. But the other 3 were cold. And my agent, who I have now, was absolutely my dream agent. Too scared to submit to her. And one day I just made myself, I stopped, I came back from the school run, didn't take off my coat, didn't go to the loo, didn't have a coffee. So I've got to send it to her. Sent it to her, and yeah, she emailed me 10 minutes later saying, send me the full. So it was it, yeah.
That's pretty much perfection when it comes to submitting.
The dream.
Nicole, do you have a bottom drawer book somewhere?
I don't have a finished one. I have lots of started and abandoned projects, but no finished ones. I've sort of always, since I was a kid, I've always just been writing and scribbling and making notes and things. Like when I've been traveling, I've got lots of tedious travel journals and things. There's always been like something I've been working on or writing on. But yeah, it's the first thing I actually finished.
Fantastic. We've got a question about superstitions. Do any of you have any superstitions that you've got to write with a particular pen, or, you know, you have to be facing a full moon, or, you know, anything at all?
I have something. So as I said, I stopped for a long time, and my husband and I were in Dubai, and he bought me this ring. And honestly, since the day I got this ring, my editing went fine. I submitted, and I cannot take this ring off now, ever. And it's actually a bit loose, but I will never take it off because I'm just terrified that if I do.
Could you find out where that ring's from?
Yeah.
Put it in the chat. Let us.
Actually, I should.
I'm going to Dubai later on this year, so I'll
Could you pick us up one, please?
Brilliant. We all want one of those. We've got a few minutes left. If you've got a burning question at home, pop it in the Q&A, and we should just about have time for it. Sarah wants to know, which book that you've read do you wish you'd written? That's a good question.
Oh, Stephen King's The Stand. Yes, please.
Why?
It is my go-to Stephen King book. It is so gripping. It has every element that a perfect book should have. great plot, great idea, apart from the fact there's a pandemic in it, which kind of makes it a little less appealing these days. But it's never the horror aspect of a Stephen King book that appeals to me. It's always his way of getting into a character's head so effortlessly. If that is one technique that I could ever perfect, that would be the one that I would steal from him completely. Brilliant characterization.
That's fabulous. And you've illustrated a piece of advice that I always give to aspiring authors, which is to not be precious about the genre that you read in, that we can enjoy and learn so much from different genres. How about you other two, Nicole and Aliya? Which book have you read that you wish you'd written?
I mean, there's so many, but in terms of an author who I really admire, I'd say Agatha Christie, because I just love her. You know, she's so prolific, and these characters that she's created and the situation, which is really interesting because it's kind of comforting and you kind of know the formula and what will happen. And yet still, you know, you're pulled into it and intrigued and a little bit surprised. So I love what she does there. I don't know what it is, but, you know, it's that real combination of, it's kind of like how when I watch Columbo, you know, it's just, I just love, yeah.
How about you, Nicole?
If I'm being really honest, I don't wish I'd written anyone else's books, because then ones I really love, I wouldn't have come to them as a reader and had that just pure pleasure in reading them. But if I were to name one of my favorite books instead, I would say David Nichols's One Day. I distinctly remember I hadn't really heard much about it at the time when I read it. I didn't know there was a big twist coming, and I just remember like sitting in bed and crying and missing a train, and it just floored me completely. And it's unusual, you know, for that to happen with a book. So I would say One Day is probably one of the books I admire the most.
Is a phenomenal book. Well, I wish I'd written all three of your books because they're all superb. And those of you watching, look at the chat box. There's a link in there for the Book Bar UK buy link page where you can buy all three of these books, and it really is worth it. They're all fantastic. Dani, when I asked you about whether it got easier after your second book, we didn't get a chance to talk about what your next book is, book number 9. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, a little. So book 9 still in production. So first draft is done, and having made it sound like I never edit, I am going to be editing this one very shortly. So yes, there's that awful trepidation, like, well, what's it going to come back with? And I haven't seen the edits yet, so it's always a bit scary. It is a book that is a slight departure. Perhaps it's a little bit more tense. It is, as the clue set in the title, set over a 6-day period. It begins with a wedding, and there's clearly some sort of obsession going on with me here with weddings. But this is where our bride turns up at the church and the groom isn't there. And everybody thinks he's jilted her except the bride, who knows that this wouldn't have happened to her. Now, is she deluded? Has something really happened to her? Had she picked the wrong man? That's what we're going to find out over 6 days.
I love that. I can't wait to read it. Sounds absolutely brilliant. Aliya, Dani, Nicole, you're as close to perfection as I can possibly imagine. This last hour has gone by so quickly, and I've got a million more questions for you. So I'm hopeful that this is something we can repeat, perhaps even in person at some point. It would be really great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining us at home. If you haven't got your copies, please rush off and do it now. Nicole, Aliya, Dani, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. It's been really great talking to you.
Thank you. It's been good fun.
Yeah, it's been brilliant.